Some have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
I'm going to read to you from Marx's Critique of the Goethe Program, one of Marx's important works. He's talking about the difference between the lower stage of communism, socialism, and the higher stage. He said, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, after prolonged birth pangs of capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. After the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. That's Karl Marx. And he's making the point there that this higher stage of communism is only possible with vast material abundance. You can only create an egalitarian society by eradicating scarcity. Only in a society where people work because they feel like working, right? Labor is life's prime want, not a necessity. Only in a society where there's really no division between mental and manual labor. Only in a society where the cooperative springs of wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can you eradicate inequality. And this is important because a lot of the voices online, a lot of the right-wing voices, Jordan Peterson and others, will try to argue that hierarchy is natural. Have we heard this? That hierarchy is just in our DNA, right? Like lobsters, right? Lobsters have DNA, they have hierarchy, so hierarchy is just natural. Well, sure, we have it in our DNA to create hierarchy, that's true. But if you look throughout human history, the nature of human hierarchies has vastly changed. Under primitive communism, there may have been some level of hierarchy, but there was no classes in the tribes. But then you had the slave systems, and then you had feudalism, and we now have capitalism. And as we move towards socialism, the necessity for hierarchies is rooted in scarcity, and that necessity vanishes. It's the eradication of scarcity that lays the basis for egalitarianism. And this is a very important point. You cannot build a stateless, classless world in poverty. You cannot do that. Lenin pointed out the revolutionary energy in 1917 and in the 20th century was in the developing world, not in the Western countries. And so the countries that moved towards socialism adopted it on the basis of scarcity. And they used socialist methods to industrialize, to raise their people out of poverty, but they were still way behind the West. But they were barricaded, and they were attacked. And you had the Korean War, 4 million people bombed and destroyed. You had the Vietnam War. You had coups in Indonesia. You know, a socialist leader was overthrown, and 500,000 people were slaughtered. And there was so much of a barricade. You talk about what Cuba has faced with the blockade. And in a situation where the socialist countries are blockaded, and they're trying to raise people out of poverty, and they're having a lot of successes, but they're still doing it on the basis of a far, far lower level of abundance. They're on the basis of scarcity. That understanding that communism, the higher stage of communism, is only possible with vast material abundance kind of gets lost. In order to make the point that they are the vanguard of the revolution, that they are motivating their people, this notion emerges that somehow you can get to the higher stage of communism in poverty. And, you know, in the final years of Stalin's life, if you read his Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, you read some of William Z. Foster's writing from that time, they argue that the Soviet Union was entering the early stages of communism. That's not true. They were not entering the higher stage of communism during that period. They were not even at the level the West was at. But they started arguing that. You have in Cuba, Che Guevara, a brave revolutionary anti-imperialist. he made the mistake of, when he was running the economy, he said that we're not going to have material incentives in Cuba. We're not going to give material incentives. People should just work hard because they want to do it for the good of the country. Well, it didn't really have very good economic results, and Che Guevara eventually moved out of running the National Bank, and they adopted policies similar to the Soviet Union, where those who worked harder, got paid more. In China, you had the Cultural Revolution. So what had happened was the Soviet Union and China had their falling out. You had the Sino-Soviet split, the two biggest socialist countries in the world, the two biggest countries in the world, one in terms of land mass is the biggest, one in terms of population is the biggest. They were divided from each other. And China first tried to argue that it was the most revolutionary. It was even more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. And so in order to do that, you had the Cultural Revolution. And the Gang of Four and Lin Biao, they tried to build an egalitarian society on the basis of a very extreme level of scarcity. In the name of the Cultural Revolution, they were arguing that even though China at that point, most people didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity, that somehow they could build a totally stateless society, a totally stateless, classless society. And it was a disaster. The Cultural Revolution was a disaster. Anyone who knows anybody who's been through there, it was a nightmare. And they were trying to build communism through sheer force of will. And that's not materialism. Ideas don't define reality. Material conditions do. The basis of communism is a higher level of abundance. The most blatant example of this mistake was Pol Pot. Pol Pot in Cambodia argued that Cambodia could go all the way to communism on the basis of an agrarian, non-industrial economy. And he confiscated all the money and burned it and was arguing that somehow they could have full communism on the basis of an agrarian economy. Well, you can't. But we understand that these countries were under attack. We understand that these countries were barricaded, and we understand they were fighting for their lives. We understand that they were trying to survive. We understand this level of confusion. And during the Cold War, you got a bit of a problem in the socialist countries, because for average working class people who worked in a factory, for average farmers, life was getting better. But there was a layer of people in the socialist bloc who things were not going so well for. One story that I've heard is about, like a doctor. A lot of people got access to training, to go to medical school, to become doctors. Once they went through medical school and went to the hardship of becoming doctors, they couldn't really do anything. And I've heard the story of a doctor, right? And his pay is maybe 4 times what everyone else's pay is. But what can he do with it, right? He can't buy another house, right? Can't invest it and start a business, obviously, right? And so yes, he gets more paper than anybody else, but at the end of the day, I mean, he's basically he's got more paper than everybody else. And the story I heard is this doctor would burn his money every night for entertainment because there was nothing he could do with it. And he'd think, I worked very, very hard to become a doctor. What do I get out of this? Right? There were a lot of engineers and technicians and skilled folks who felt kind of stifled. They were working in a state-run industry. They might have an idea about how to do something better and more efficiently, but their idea is going to get shot down. And what are they going to do? They're going to start their own business? Of course not. Everything's run by the state. There were a lot of artists who wanted to make films their own way, didn't like having censors tell them what to do, right? They didn't quite understand that here in the United States, if you work for a Hollywood studio, they're going to control way more than what you make in your films, but they felt suppressed. And there was a layer of people, this strata, this intelligentsia, that had real grievances with the socialist system and were very, very frustrated. And the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, in particular Zbigniew Brzezinski, worked very, very hard to court those folks. George Soros, now we know the name George Soros, the Hungarian billionaire, he started funding art galleries in the Soviet Union. And the idea was if the Soviet government won't pay for your art, well, George Soros will, right? And movements like this were happening, and there was a huge effort to court those folks. You had in Czechoslovakia in 1968, you had the Prague Spring. And that was basically, there was a guy named Dubček who was anti-Soviet, who had become the leader, and he had the support of this strata of people, these frustrated intellectuals, some of whom came from the most privileged sectors of Soviet society. They were the children of the party elite, but they were frustrated. And so Dubček mobilized them to go out, and the Soviet Union was forced to send in the military. And what happened during the Prague Spring is that's the first time in US media that we start to see a really common trope in the late Cold War. So the Soviet Union sent its military into Czechoslovakia. Now, there were plenty of people in Czechoslovakia who supported it, and plenty who didn't, right? It was divided. But those who supported it, supported Dubček and supported the uprising, were portrayed as artists and hippies and had flowers, and they were just peace-loving. But how were the people who supported the Soviet Union in Czechoslovakia represented? What did we see? Tanks. What you saw was just, a tank. A cold mechanical piece of machinery. And the narrative suddenly became that the Soviet Union, the communist countries, are all just these, cold authoritarian societies. Meanwhile, the people protesting them are these free-thinking individuals. They didn't show the working people that might have supported the Soviet Union. They didn't show the farmers who might have supported. They just showed the tank. Now, what you were referring to before, and this is in Philip Benoski's book, Afghanistan, Washington's Secret War. He talks about, in Afghanistan, 1978, you had a situation where the Communist Party was facing being killed, being exterminated. And so the People's Democratic Party, it was called, they rose up to not be killed, basically, and took power prematurely to avoid being killed. They overthrew the king. It was called the Sour Revolution, 1978. And of course, the CIA then began organizing people like Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi to go to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union and try to build kind of a global jihad against the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union, not wanting to have a center of Islamic terrorism on their border, they at that point, they sent their military to Afghanistan. And Philip Benoski was a reporter who was stationed in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. And he talked about the fact that, the day that the Soviet military came to Kabul, right, the capital, the Soviet military, there were all kinds of Soviet military people there. There were all kinds of different Soviet press conferences and all of that to announce the Soviet Union's presence in Afghanistan. But all the TV cameras were surrounded around one single tank in the capital of Kabul to push that narrative that the Soviet Union was just this cold mechanical piece of machinery. They didn't talk to the women who wanted to, not have acid poured on their faces for not wearing veils. They didn't talk to the farmers who were getting Soviet aid and building their crops. And, were there bad things the Soviet Union did in Afghanistan? Sure. But the narrative was tanks. And this term tankies that we hear is an allusion to that. It's this idea that the Soviet Union and communism are this cold mechanical piece of machinery, and representing the opposition as independent artists and thinkers. And that's what was being done. Now, what's interesting is in China, I believe it was shortly before Mao died, 1976, Zhou Enlai died. And Zhou Enlai had been somebody who had been a little bit more friendly to the artists and intellectuals and folks like that in China, and he died. And at his funeral, a lot of college-educated folks, technicians, scientists, engineers, they gathered at his funeral, and they rioted. And they burned cars, and they chanted anti-communist slogans, down with communism, and they burned a lot of things. It was called the Tiananmen Incident of 1976, and it was an anti-communist riot that happened just before Mao died. Mao died shortly after that, but Deng Xiaoping came into power. And when Deng Xiaoping came into power, he launched the reform and opening up. A lot of those folks who had rioted and had been anti-communist were won back to supporting the Communist Party because Deng Xiaoping enabled them to start their own businesses. And he enabled them to run a company and have foreign investment come in. And largely what motivated China's reform and opening up was the understanding that those folks were the basis of a potential counter-revolution. And that also their creativity and their brilliance and their intellectual independence shouldn't be seen as a threat to a socialist society, but rather it should be seen as an asset, right? Hijack it, use it, right? Sure, the Chinese Communist Party controls the economy. It regulates the economy. It has a number of state-run industries. It has 5-year economic plans. You'll see articles in the capitalist press where they'll say things to the effect of there's no such thing as a private company in China. And there's an element of truth in that, because at any point the government can come and show up and say, no, you're going to build this and not that, right? I mean, even the private sector is controlled. But in China, Deng Xiaoping had the innovation to use the creativity of these folks and to harness it to build socialism rather than trying to contain it. And you'll notice that in 1989 and 1990, 1991, it was those intellectuals, it was those students that were the basis of the counter-revolution, the overthrow of socialism in country after country after country. And there was an attempt at that in 1989 in China, but it failed. In China, it did not succeed. And the reason it didn't succeed is because they had a different approach, right? Everyone knows the Soviet Union needed reform in the late 1980s. There was no way they could continue operating as they did. But in the process of trying to reform it, they fell. The problem was that the Soviet Union had been barricaded, and it had been attacked, and it had been through World War II. 27 million people died in World War II. We're still talking about our Civil War here. We're fighting about Confederate monuments. Only 500,000 people died in the U.S. Civil War. 27 million Russian and Soviet people died in World War II. So a society that's that attacked, it develops a very, very, very rigid way of operating. The Soviet Union needed to change, but it wasn't able to. Whereas the Chinese Communist Party has been constantly changing since the moment it was created. There's not a year that goes by that the Chinese Communist Party is the same as it was before. It's in a constant state of evolution, constant state of change. And so the Chinese Communist Party was able to survive. What's interesting is that the phrase that we often hear from Deng Xiaoping, he said, Poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. That's a reference to Marx and the understanding that you need material abundance, right? And Deng Xiaoping reasserted that. What had been lost during the Cold War, this understanding that full communism is based on material abundance, it had been restored by Deng Xiaoping. He rescued that concept, and that's very, very important. The reason that we want to have socialism is because we want growth. We want to eradicate poverty. We want to eradicate illiteracy. We want to eradicate unemployment. We want to raise the level of productive forces in society. If socialism is not doing that, socialism is failing. The point is not to have the correct political line and people are poor. The point of socialism is to rationally organize the economy so that growth is unlimited so we can reach that higher stage. And when that message gets lost, when it becomes about being pure or being egalitarian, at that point you're not talking about Marxism anymore. At that point you're not being materialist. And that's very important. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union in Europe, in Eastern Europe, there was an economic catastrophe. And we always hear, again, the myth of the 20th century, socialism never achieved anything. Well, look what happened when free market capitalism was imposed on the former USSR. Shock therapy, mass unemployment, hunger, sex trafficking of women, heroin addiction. I mean, it was a nightmare. The 1990s was a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, Russia lost roughly 10% of its population during that time. People either leaving the country or dying. It was a humanitarian nightmare. And in Latin America, neoliberal shock therapy economic policies were also pushed. The USA had tolerated, like a lot of kind of authoritarian military juntas that did some economic development. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, they didn't need to do that anymore. They didn't need these countries to function as kind of a barricade or a bulwark against socialism. So free market policies were imposed on Venezuela and imposed on Bolivia. Bolivia, they privatized the water. If you collected rainwater on your rooftop, you were stealing from Nestle or Coca-Cola, right? Right, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it was a nightmare. So in response to that, the communists of Latin America reoriented themselves. Before, under the military regimes, it had been impossible to organize in the cities. In Chile under Pinochet, if you were in a city passing out leaflets for communism, you disappeared and were never heard from again. So communists in Chile had organized in the countryside, and they'd organized the very poor people in the countryside, tried to do what Che Guevara did, organize like a peasant war. Well, under the neoliberal model, where you have more of an open society in terms of free elections and such, but you have neoliberal shock therapy, the communists of Latin America started organizing a popular front against neoliberalism. And the orientation that communists got from Cuba and from other countries was that instead of fighting in the countryside, the strategy should be to operate in the urban areas and build a popular front against neoliberalism. And there were some pretty big successes with that. And we saw how Hugo Chavez was elected in Venezuela. And he was first elected saying that he didn't believe in socialism or capitalism. He was for the third way, whatever is best for Venezuela. But then, after he was elected, there was an attempted military coup against him, and the workers poured out into the streets to support him, and the rank-and-file soldiers supported him as well. And pretty soon, Chavez was not only back in power, but he was announcing that their goal was to move Venezuela toward 21st century socialism. And in Bolivia, we saw the election of Evo Morales. Again, the election was a referendum on neoliberalism. Are you for the cuts and privatizations? Are you against it? But as Evo Morales gets into office, the masses of people and workers are in motion and supporting him. And pretty soon, Bolivia is moving towards socialism. The Sandinistas are back in power in Nicaragua. And again, they adopted their program. It became a referendum. Vote for the Sandinistas if you're against neoliberalism. Vote for the opposition if you support it. And the people voted for the Sandinistas, and they're back in power. And socialism has reemerged in Latin America on the basis of this strategy of building a popular front. And of course, it follows that pattern that we talked about before, whereas the communists have a program. And they polarize society on the basis of their demand, opposing neoliberalism. And they are able to take power. But then in order to enact their program of fighting the cuts and providing jobs and education, they're forced to write new constitutions and create new forms of militaries, right? They have the Bolivarian militias and change the Venezuelan military is trained in Cuba, and they have to change the nature of society. They have to enact the dictatorship of the proletariat. And once you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, you are then able to move toward a fully socialist society. And that process has been unfolding in Latin America. Meanwhile, we have a situation in China where there's a lot of people who like to say China is socialist in name only. But you'll notice that President Xi Jinping, when he got into office, the US media screamed because he required every member of the Chinese Communist Party to watch 2 documentaries. One, about the fall of the Soviet Union and why it happened and why that was a danger to China. Two, about the evils of U.S. imperialism and what the U.S. imperialists do around the world. And there's a huge revival of socialist and Marxist culture in China. And with a state-run economy, millions of people are being raised out of poverty, and there's a revival of that. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, you have the Islamic Revolution of Iran, the slogan, not capitalism, but Islam, neither East nor West. It's definitely not a Marxist current. They reject Marxist ideology, but they are very much anti-imperialists, and they very much see capitalism as their enemy. They have pictures of Hugo Chavez and Che Guevara and Malcolm X on display. And at this point, the city-building tendency in human history, the people that have wanted to advance and raise people out of poverty, is very well alive. There are revolutionaries in power all over the world today. In China, there are revolutionaries in power in Cuba. There are revolutionaries in power in Bolivia. There are revolutionaries in power in Venezuela. There are revolutionaries in the government of Iran. There are revolutionaries in the government of Russia. All over the world, there are anti-imperialists and revolutionaries who seek to use science and human understanding to control the means of production and raise people out of poverty. And the imperialists who keep the world poor so that they can stay rich and beat down and destroy countries are facing off against them. And this is the contradiction in the world today. It is between the anti-imperialist bloc, of which communists are the central thesis, and the imperialist bloc that is in a crisis spawned by capitalism and its natural problems, the general law of capitalist accumulation, the falling rate of profits, etc. This is the contradiction we're in the world today. In one part of the world, they believe in growth and human progress. In another part of the world, they believe in making people poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. And I view the Center for Political Innovation as an educational think tank that represents the city-building tendency around the world. And right now, unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion. You go to communist conferences and gatherings around the world, the way leftists in the United States talk is very different than the way leftists talk in Latin America, or in Africa, or in Asia, or in China, or in Vietnam. There's a big difference. There's revolutionaries in the government of Vietnam. There's a big difference. And that will be the topic of our second class this afternoon. So thank you very much. All right.
Why is it lost on most libertarians that Lenin supported small-scale capitalism?
Oh. Why? I mean, the new economic policy you're referring to, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was, the Soviet Union did something similar to what China is doing. It was on a much smaller scale. But yes, they did have private businesses, free market reforms. You're exactly right about that. Yes, yeah, in order to strengthen socialism. He said the commanding heights, the banks, the major industries should be state-run, but that they did have the new economic policy where they had free markets in Russia. I shouldn't call them free markets, but they had private businesses operating in order to strengthen socialism. That's correct.
So, we should, when we discuss these terms with libertarians who are against corporate cronyism, as they call it, wouldn't it be more effective for us to bring up the fact that Lenin and, supported small businesses?
Yeah.
Because that's what libertarians are all about, small mom-and-pop businesses and not being overrun by the state, like that. Yeah.
We're pro-business, they're pro-poverty.
Yeah. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that with Deng Xiaoping and the letting 1,000 flowers bloom and market socialism, I feel like there's a lot of confusion on the left, the American left, in terms of, I've heard like Michael Hudson call China industrial capitalist versus finance capitalism in the U.S., or a lot of people say it's state capitalism like Saudi Arabia. So can you just speak to that and dispel the myth that it's just state capitalism?
Oh, sure. Well, there's certainly state capitalism in the world, right? State capitalism is when the state is involved in capitalism. Capitalism is production organized for profit, and we need to be very clear about that. So there's this belief it's socialist if the government does it, right? We've heard that. Post office is socialist and all that. That's not what socialism is. There's government involvement and state involvement in every capitalist society. Some capitalist societies have a lot of government involvement, and some have little. But at the end of the day, in a capitalist economy, production is carried out for profit, and in a socialist economy, it's forced to be carried out for social use. Whether it's private corporations being forced to carry them out for social use, whether it's a state, industries, production for social use, socialism, production for profit, capitalism. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain had been destroyed. And so in order to rebuild the country, they nationalized pretty much everything. The railroads were nationalized, the industries were nationalized, very high rate of state ownership. But was Britain socialist? No, because it was simply rebuilding these things so that British imperialist corporations could continue to dominate the world, so that they could operate according to serve these British imperialist corporations and their desire to make super profits. And in the 80s, they privatized a lot of them under Thatcher. It was simply a mechanism for managing capitalism. And if you go to like Singapore, for example, is a capitalist country with a heavy amount of state involvement. Saudi Arabia is a capitalist country where pretty much everything in the country is the private property of the royal family. But at the end of the day, the means of production function to make profits for private owners. There are 5 families in Singapore, and the economy of Singapore, it may be heavily state involved, but it's organized to make profits for them. Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of state ownership, but the state is involved in facilitating the making of profits by the royal family and their cronies. And in Britain, you had the nationalizations. There's many other examples, but if it's simply state ownership, but it's still production for profit, that's capitalism. The difference is when you have a state that has a hostile relationship with capital, when the state has come to power in some kind of popular revolution or struggle. And when the state is controlling the capitalists, it's not controlling the economy for their benefit, but it's rather controlling the capitalists and forcing them to serve the overall state central plan. When you have revolutionary committees in neighborhoods, that is the basis of socialism. When you have 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, where every apartment building has a party member in it who's monitoring the building and carrying out the goals. And that is also, let me add, why I would maintain that, despite the issues with human rights, which there are certainly plenty of, that in a way, the socialist countries of this world are more democratic than the Western capitalist countries are. And they're more democratic. The government could not be in power without a highly mobilized population. The government depends on a well-organized, highly mobilized population in order to carry out its goals. And because of that fact, because the government is reliant on an organized population carrying out its goals, that's more democratic. Our government is not reliant on us carrying out its goals. They've got a whole apparatus of police and they don't need us. They want us out of politics. They want us, watching American Idol. They don't want us in politics. But when the state is actively dependent on the population being mobilized to carry its goals, when you have community assemblies and councils, the government of Iran wouldn't be in power for a minute if it weren't for the Basij councils that are in every neighborhood that carry out its goals on a local level. Venezuela depends on the Bolivarian circles. And that is more democratic. Issues of human rights aside, that is more democratic. When you have a highly involved, mobilized population, that's democracy. Democracy simply means rule of the people, right? In ancient Greece, they talked about a cycle, right? They talked about there's a monarchy, but when it turns bad, it becomes a tyranny. And then there's an oligarchy, and that's a good elite, but when they turn bad, it becomes a plutocracy. And in ancient Greece, they said you have a republic, which is an elected government, but when that turns bad, it becomes a democracy, which is crazy mob rule. Democracy literally just means the rule of the people. It's a concept that means the rule of the people. And it's a vague thing that we're kind of taught to worship. It's kind of like this concept of natural rights, as if it's always been around. You could have a monarchy that could be a democracy. If all the people of the country wanted it, and they wanted this king to rule over them, that could be a democracy. It's a stupid political science. I took political science in college. I've read Plato's Republic far more times than I ever wanted to, right? And this is a non-materialist understanding of these concepts. The concept of democracy means the rule of the people. When the people are involved in carrying out the government's decisions, that's more democracy. So there you go.
The question of China, the question of Russia as imperialist countries, isn't it that a country can become imperialist when there's a concentration of capital in the country, when there's monopolies in the country, and then they start to export capital? Wouldn't that, by definition, make Russia or China imperialist? That's a question.
Okay. All right.
Any other question? I have a question, but I could answer the question.
Okay, go ahead and answer. Go ahead and answer.
So I would say the reason why the monopolies in China and Russia are not imperialist is because they're not operating off the profit motive. In the United States, there's a small group of oil and banking cartels, and they're looking to maximize their profit and world control, even if they have some managerial aspects of it. But that's not what China, the centers of economic power in China and Russia are doing. In Russia, they have a nationalized oil company where it's highly government controlled, and those profits are used to reinvest in the country, and the government has supremacy over it and can advocate the national interest of that country. That, by definition, is not Lenin's definition of imperialism. And the same is true in China, where the government has 5-year plans, has abilities, wants to raise people out of poverty, wants to offer trade, wants to lift up their neighbors in win-win trade deals. This is not short-term profits for a few monopoly capitalists. This is not monopoly capitalism. This is not imperialism. I wanted to say a comment about coalition building. I think what Latin America is doing with the Bolivarian revolutions recently in Peru, the election there is absolutely inspiring. And I would like to see us, try to do stuff like in the United States. When I first got into activism in college, I was involved with a local branch of the Jobs with Justice. And the Jobs with Justice organization was like an NGO organization that would unite civil rights leaders with labor unions. And we'd find common ground, and we'd go out and support each other's protests. And I did that locally. And I'm thinking about, that's kind of like a kernel of what I'm thinking. What would a coalition, an anti-neoliberal, and neoliberalism is imperialism. So anti-imperialist coalition look like in the United States. Well, the propaganda machine is so huge here, and in the imperial core, they have so much money, billions of dollars, that go into these weird propaganda campaigns that convince everybody to support either, the left wing or the right wing of duopoly. And they just kind of funnel these places, and they get rural and urban workers to fight against each other. But how are we going to, I think one of the major things we can do is build organizations, militant organizations in our community that actually represent the people, number one. But then once we have those organizations, how do we get those organizations to work together? How do we get, maybe a black nationalist organization that's fighting against police brutality to say it's neoliberal and imperialism that's doing this to you? And then maybe a labor organization, not to support the Democrats because they're not in our interests. They continually to sheepdog us and to lie to us and to get them work with the black nationalists, Chicano nationalists, as well as a variety of community organizations from labor and different communities, rural and urban alike.
And I think someone was asking earlier, how do we combat like a liberal or libertarian view that they're like more logical or whatever, and socialism is based in idealism, and it's really about highlighting just the opposite, is that like Lenin said, dialectical materialism is the true philosophy because people can see what things as they are. It's not about idealizing certain things or great man theories. It's about how many people socialism has fed, how many people have been given a house, how many people have been able to receive electricity through these great projects. So I think that's kind of that's what's great about the CPI, in my view.
Yeah, very good.
I wanted to just say something real quick. I think one of the biggest things as an organizer and going door to door and everything that it's taught me is that, a lot of people, kind of talk about a lot of organizations. Why can't they, work together and this and that and that and this? But, I think that mainly it's the mass of the people, right? There's millions of non-voters in this country that actually, quite honestly, a lot of times agree with us. A lot of people, I was talking to this veteran the other day, he was against the war, he was a Trump guy, right? But he was against the war. He realized that a lot of soldiers were really taken advantage of over there, and there's a lot of people that just ordinary people that maybe not in politics, that are open to our message.